I never thought much about my neighbor, Mark. He was the kind of person you barely noticed. He lived alone in the house next to mine for nearly 6 years. He kept his lawn perfectly trimmed, never played loud music, and rarely spoke to anyone unless he absolutely had to. If you asked anyone on our street about him, they'd probably describe him as quiet. That's exactly how I would have described him too, until last summer. It started on a Tuesday night. I woke up at exactly 3:07 a.m. to a strange metallic sound. At first I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again. Clang. A few seconds later. Clang. Clang. I sat up in bed and listened carefully. The sound was coming from outside. I got up and walked to the bedroom window overlooking my backyard. The moment I looked outside, I froze. Mark was standing in his backyard under the glow of a single floodlight. He was digging, not gardening, not planting flowers, digging, deep. The hole looked massive. Every few seconds he would drive his shovel into the ground and throw another pile of dirt over his shoulder. I remember thinking how strange it was. Who digs a hole at 3 in the morning? I watched for maybe 2 minutes before going back to bed. I figured there had to be some reasonable explanation. The next morning, I looked out my kitchen window while making coffee. The hole was gone. Not covered. Gone. The ground looked completely flat, as if nothing had happened. I found it odd, but I didn't think much of it. A week later, it happened again. 3:14 a.m. The same metallic sound woke me up. This time I immediately rushed to the window. Mark was digging another hole. Different location, same backyard, same floodlight, same frantic energy. I watched him for nearly 20 minutes. He kept stopping to look around, checking neighboring houses, scanning windows, making sure nobody was watching. Eventually, he dragged something heavy across the yard. I couldn't see what it was. The object was wrapped in a dark tarp. Then he lowered it into the hole. I felt a chill run through my body. By morning, the yard looked untouched again. A few days later, the entire neighborhood was talking about something else. A 16-year-old girl named Emma had disappeared. She lived only 3 streets away. Her parents were frantic. Search parties formed. Missing person posters appeared everywhere. Police officers went door to door asking questions. The whole town was on edge. I didn't immediately connect the two things. I wish I could say I did, but I didn't. Then another month passed, and I heard the shovel again. 3:02 a.m. This time I grabbed my phone. I recorded everything. Mark digging, looking around, sweating despite the cool night air. The video wasn't great because of the darkness, but it was enough to show that he was definitely burying something. The following morning, I decided to walk past his property. The backyard fence wasn't very tall. As I passed, I noticed a patch of freshly turned soil near the fence line. Something white was sticking out. At first, I thought it was trash. Then I realized it looked like part of a cell phone case. I glanced around. Nobody was outside. I reached through a gap in the fence and pulled it out. It was a broken phone. The screen was shattered. Mud covered most of it. When I cleaned it off at home, I noticed a sticker on the back. A small sunflower. The exact same sunflower sticker that appeared in several photos on Emma's missing person flyer. I felt sick. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe lots of people had similar stickers. That's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, I knew. I called the police. They came out later that afternoon. I showed them the phone. I showed them the video. I explained everything. The officer listened politely, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Still, they took the phone as evidence. 2 days later, police vehicles flooded our street. Detectives arrived. Crime scene units arrived. Then a large excavator rolled into Mark's backyard. I watched from my front porch as they dug, and dug, and dug, for hours. The entire neighborhood gathered outside. Nobody spoke. Around sunset, I noticed a sudden change. The officers stopped moving. Several of them stepped back. One detective removed his hat. Another covered his mouth. That's when I knew they had found something. But I wasn't prepared for what came next. The following morning, the news broke. Police had discovered human remains buried beneath Mark's backyard. Not one body, 3. The first belonged to Emma. The second belonged to a college student who had disappeared 4 years earlier. The third belonged to a woman who had vanished nearly a decade ago from a neighboring county. Authorities later revealed that Mark had been connected to none of them. At least, not publicly. Nobody knew how he found them. Nobody knew why he chose them. Nobody knew how long he had been doing it. But the most disturbing part came during the investigation. Detectives found dozens of photographs inside his house. Pictures of people from all over town. Some were taken through windows. Some showed victims walking alone. Some had dates written on the back. Every photograph was carefully organized, like a collection, like trophies. Mark was arrested that same day. He never spoke to the media, never confessed, never explained anything. As far as I know, he's still in prison. But the reason I'm telling this story now is because of something that happened after his arrest. Something I never told the police. The night before they dug up his backyard, I received a text message from an unknown number. It arrived at exactly 3:07 a.m., the same time I first saw him digging. The message contained only 6 words. You should have kept watching. A few seconds later, the number disconnected. Police were never able to trace it, and to this day, I still don't know whether the message came from Mark or from someone helping him. I never thought I would be the kind of person telling a story like this. For most of my life, I believed the truly disturbing things happened to other people. They happened on the news. They happened in documentaries. They happened in places far away from quiet neighborhoods like ours. I was wrong. This happened 3 years ago, and even now, my daughter refuses to talk about it. At the time, she was 15 years old. We lived on a quiet suburban street where everybody knew everybody. Kids rode their bikes until sunset. Neighbors waved while mowing their lawns. Nothing exciting ever happened. Across the street lived a man named Richard. He was in his early 50s, divorced, and lived alone. When we first moved into the neighborhood, he seemed perfectly normal, friendly even. He introduced himself on our first day, brought over cookies around Christmas, and occasionally offered to help people with yard work. Everyone knew him. Nobody had a bad thing to say about him, at least not then. The first strange thing happened about 6 months after we moved in. One afternoon, my daughter came home from school and mentioned that Richard had been standing outside when her bus arrived. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he knew she had made the honor roll. She hadn't told anyone outside our family. I assumed maybe one of the neighbors had mentioned it. We didn't think much of it. A few weeks later, he stopped her while she was walking our dog. He congratulated her on getting an A on a difficult math test. Again, something nobody should have known. My wife and I exchanged worried looks that night. It felt strange, but not dangerous. Not yet. Over the following months, things became harder to explain. Richard always seemed to know exactly where my daughter was. If she went for a walk, he'd somehow be outside. If she sat in the front yard reading, he'd suddenly appear to check his mailbox. If she rode her bike around the neighborhood, he'd be sitting on his porch watching. Always watching. At first, we convinced ourselves it was coincidence. Then came the gifts. Nothing expensive. A book he thought she'd like. A necklace. A stuffed animal. Every time, we returned them. Every time, he apologized. And every time, another gift appeared a few weeks later. Eventually, I walked across the street and told him directly that it needed to stop. To his credit, he seemed embarrassed. He apologized several times and promised it wouldn't happen again. For a little while, it didn't. Then the letters started. The first one appeared in our mailbox with no stamp and no return address. Inside was a single handwritten sentence. "She's different from the others." That was it. No signature. Nothing. We assumed it was a prank. Then another arrived. And another. One read, "Don't let her change." Another said, "Some people are meant for greater things." The handwriting looked shaky and uneven. Something about it felt wrong. My wife wanted to call the police immediately. I thought maybe we were overreacting. I regret that now. A month later, my daughter came home from school crying. Someone had left an envelope on our front porch. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Pictures of her walking to school. Pictures of her sitting in the park with friends. Pictures of her eating lunch. Pictures taken from far away. Pictures taken without her knowledge. Some had clearly been taken weeks apart. Whoever had taken them had been watching her for a long time. That was the moment everything changed. We contacted the police. An officer took a report, but explained that photographs alone weren't enough to identify a suspect. We installed security cameras around the property. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then came the night I will never forget. It was around 2:15 in the morning. I woke up to a loud thud against the side of the house. A few seconds later, another. Then another. I jumped out of bed and ran toward the sound. My daughter was already awake and screaming from her bedroom. When I turned on the outdoor lights, I felt my stomach drop. The exterior wall beneath her window was covered in a disgusting brown substance. Several burst balloons were scattered across the lawn. The smell hit me immediately. Human waste. Someone had filled balloons with urine and feces and thrown them directly at her bedroom window. The police arrived within 20 minutes. They documented everything and collected what evidence they could. The following night, we stayed awake. Nothing happened. Neither did the next night, or the next. Then, exactly 1 week later, it happened again. This time, the cameras caught everything. I'll never forget watching that footage. A figure emerged from the darkness at 2:03 a.m. Even before the camera captured his face, I knew who it was. Richard. He was carrying a plastic bag. One by one, he removed several balloons. He walked across the street, filled with complete confidence, like someone who had done this before. He launched them at my daughter's window. Then he stepped back and just stood there, watching. The footage continued for nearly 50 minutes. He never moved, never sat down, never looked away. He simply stared at my daughter's bedroom window from the darkness, motionless, waiting. When detectives searched his house the next day, they found things that still make me sick to think about. Hundreds of photographs. Not dozens, hundreds. Some dated back years. Entire boxes dedicated to my daughter. Every school year, every haircut, every birthday, every routine. Some photographs had been taken from inside our property, behind our fence, near her bedroom window, places he should never have been able to access. The police also discovered notebooks, page after page documenting her schedule, what time she left for school, when she walked the dog, when she spent time with friends, when she went to bed. It was like reading the journal of someone who had built his entire life around watching another person. Richard was arrested that day. Eventually, we learned that we weren't the first family. Years earlier, another family had moved away after reporting similar behavior. Nothing had ever been proven. Nothing had ever stuck. Until now. We moved out less than a month later. My daughter never felt safe in that house again. Neither did we. The last time I saw Richard was on the day the moving truck arrived. I was carrying boxes to the driveway when I looked across the street. He was standing behind his living room window, watching us. The same way he had watched for years. The same blank expression on his face. The same cold stare. He knew we could see him. He didn't care. He simply stood there and watched us leave. When my wife and I bought our first house, we thought we had gotten incredibly lucky. The property sat at the end of a quiet country road surrounded by trees. The nearest neighbor was over 100 yards away. It was the kind of place where you could sit outside at night and hear nothing but crickets and the wind moving through the woods. It felt peaceful, safe. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. Then strange things started happening. Small things. The kind of things you don't immediately question. A carton of milk that seemed emptier than it should have been. Leftovers disappearing faster than expected. A cabinet door left open. A light turned on in a room neither of us remembered entering. Every time something happened, one of us blamed the other. Did you eat the rest of the chicken? No. Then where did it go? Neither of us could ever explain it. But life was busy, and we didn't spend much time thinking about it. Then came the noises. The first time I heard them was around midnight. I was lying in bed when I heard a slow, creaking sound above us. It lasted only a few seconds. Then it stopped. I assumed the house was settling. Old houses make noise. Everyone knows that. The next night I heard it again. Only this time it sounded different. Not creaking. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. As if somebody was carefully walking across the ceiling. I sat upright in bed and listened. My wife heard it too. We both stared at each other. Neither of us said anything. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds before stopping completely. The next morning, I grabbed a flashlight and climbed into the attic. I expected to find an animal, a raccoon, a squirrel, anything. Instead, I found nothing. No nests, no droppings, no signs of activity whatsoever. The attic looked untouched. I climbed back down and forgot about it, at least for a while. Over the next month, the strange incidents became impossible to ignore. Food continued disappearing. Objects moved around the house. A television remote would appear in a different room. Kitchen chairs shifted positions overnight. One morning, my wife discovered muddy footprints on the laundry room floor. They didn't belong to either of us. That was the first time I genuinely felt uneasy. We checked every door and every window. Everything was locked. Nothing had been forced open. There was no sign that anyone had entered. Weeks passed. The footsteps continued. Always late at night. Always above us. Always stopping before I could reach the attic ladder. Then one morning, something happened that changed everything. I walked into the kitchen and froze. One of our dining room chairs had been moved. Not slightly. Completely across the room. It now sat directly beneath the attic hatch. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I called for my wife. She immediately swore she hadn't touched it. Neither had I. For the first time, neither of us tried explaining it away. That afternoon, I bought security cameras. I installed one facing the kitchen and another covering the hallway. The first 2 nights were uneventful. Nothing happened. On the 3rd night, I woke up at around 3 a.m. I checked the camera app on my phone out of curiosity. Everything appeared normal. The kitchen was empty. I went back to sleep. The next morning, while reviewing the footage, I nearly dropped my phone. At exactly 2:41 a.m., the attic hatch slowly opened. Not all at once. Slowly. As if whoever was inside was trying not to make a sound. Then a hand appeared, followed by an arm, then a head. I remember my stomach instantly dropping. A woman climbed down into our kitchen. She looked thin, filthy. Her clothes were stained and worn. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. For several seconds, she simply stood there, listening, making sure we were asleep. Then she walked to the refrigerator. She opened it and began eating. Not taking food, eating it right there in our kitchen, like she belonged in the house. She drank directly from a bottle of orange juice, opened containers, took leftovers. Then she started wandering through the house, watching, looking at family photographs, examining personal belongings, standing in doorways. At one point, she entered our bedroom. The camera couldn't see inside, but we later calculated that she remained there for nearly 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Standing somewhere in our bedroom while we slept. Eventually, she returned to the kitchen, climbed back into the attic, and disappeared. I immediately called the police. Officers arrived within half an hour. When they searched the attic, they found something straight out of a nightmare. Hidden behind insulation and wooden beams was a small living area. Someone had been living there. Not for days. Not for weeks. For months. There were blankets, bottles of water, food wrappers, flashlights, batteries, personal belongings. The woman was found hiding in a narrow crawl space and was taken into custody without a struggle. According to investigators, she had likely been living above us for at least 7 months. 7 months. 7 months of listening to our conversations, watching us, learning our routines, knowing when we left, knowing when we slept. I thought that was the end of the story. I was wrong. A few weeks later, detectives returned some of the evidence recovered from the attic. Among the items was a notebook. Inside were hundreds of handwritten entries. Most were observations about us. What time we woke up, what we ate, arguments we'd had, phone calls we'd made, private conversations that had taken place behind closed doors. She knew everything. The notebook was disturbing enough, but it wasn't the worst thing they found. Tucked inside the back cover was a photograph. It showed our house, taken from inside the attic. The date written on the back was nearly a year before we moved in. At first, I didn't understand why that mattered. Then one of the detectives pointed something out. If the date was accurate, the woman couldn't have taken the photograph. She wasn't living there yet, at least according to everything they knew. That discovery led investigators to review additional evidence. Eventually, they found something even stranger. A memory card hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Most of the files were corrupted, but one video still worked. The footage showed the attic months before the woman arrived. The timestamp confirmed it. Someone was already living there. The camera shook as the person recording crawled through the attic. Then, for a brief moment, another figure appeared on screen. A man, just standing there in the darkness, watching the camera. The clip ended seconds later. Police never identified him. The woman claimed she had always lived alone. Investigators never found evidence linking her to anyone else. Officially, the case was closed. But I still think about that video. Because whoever that man was, he knew about the attic. He knew about the hidden space. And at some point, he was inside our house. The woman was arrested. The attic was cleared. And eventually we moved away. But even now, years later, there's one thing I can't forget. The police told us the woman had been living above us for 7 months. The notebook proved she had been watching us every day. Yet the very first entry about my wife and me was dated 3 weeks before we even bought the house. To this day, nobody has ever explained how that's possible.